All right, guys, we're going to go over a quick review of Unit 2 to prepare for the test. All right, the first thing I want to discuss is some elements of poetry. Okay, I'll discuss all the poems together. First, I want to talk about rhyme scheme. Okay, so rhyming words have the same sort of ending, and these in this poem are end rhymes. The rhyme occurs at the end of the line of poetry. So if I ask you on the test, what is the rhyme scheme of this poem, you're going to assign each of the rhymes a letter, okay? So here we have the panther is like a leopard, except he hasn't been peppered. Should you behold a panther crouch, prepare to say ouch. Better yet, if called by a panther, don't answer. So one thing I want to point out here, peppered, remember, it's like he's sprinkled with pepper, so they mean the panther isn't spotted, okay? All right, so moving on to the next slide, you'll see here leopard and peppered rhyme, so both of those are going to be A. All right, crouch and ouch rhyme, so they will both be B. Panther and anther rhyme, those will both be C. So the rhyme scheme is AA, BB, CC. All right, the next one, we have the windmill. This is just a small selection out of the poem. His tireless merry slave, the wind, is busy with his work today. From whensoever he comes to grind, he has a will and knows the way. Okay, so you might notice here, wind and grind, they look the same at the end, right? I-N-D, but when you say them out loud, it's wind and grind instead of wind and grind, right? So it's not exactly a rhyme, but it looks like a rhyme to our eyes. So we call this an I rhyme. But for the sake of the rhyme scheme, we're going to still make those pairs. Okay, on the next slide, you'll see wind matches with grind and today matches with way, sorry. So we'll say A, B, A, B. That is the rhyme scheme for this poem. All right, next I want to point out a little bit of figurative language in poetry. And figurative language is just language that is not literal. So first, concrete imagery is imagery that appeals to your five senses. And the poem Wild Blackberries is full of concrete imagery. So here are just a few samples. So appealing to your sense of smell, we have juices fermented from our pores. So this is sweat, right? So that would definitely be something you can smell. I think they also mention pungent oil, right? So something that's appealing to your sense of smell. Your touch, the heat crawled on our skin, okay? Your skin is going to feel the heat of the day. And then you have taste, hot blackberries melted our quick tongue. So imagine tasting the sweetness of the blackberries, okay? And this poem also contains some metaphors. So they're comparing two things. They call the sun the July heart, okay? It's hot, it's up in the sky, it's July heart. And then at the end of the poem, they say black suns dancing in the white, white summer sky. And this is the image of blackberries in a bowl of cream. Okay, so more figurative language. So you'll also see metaphors in the hillside thaw, and this one runs, the same metaphor runs through the entire poem, so we will call this an extended metaphor. So the whole poem is comparing these lizards with melting snow, okay? So the poem is actually about how it looks when snow is melting down the side of a hill, and the author thinks it looks like silver lizards crawling down the hill, right? So he calls silver lizards, that's melting snow. He says the sun's a wizard, and he's just talking about how the heat of the day will melt the snow. And the moon's a witch. The lower temperatures at night will refreeze the snow. Okay? So also, we have the rainy day. In that, he's comparing his rainy days when it's cloudy and gray outside to sad days in life, right? And so when you're having a bad day, it kind of gives you that same mental image of a rainy, gray day. All right, and in Midnight Storm, they're talking about the power of nature. There's a contrast between how powerful nature is, like a thunderstorm, with the size, the limitation, and weakness of man, right? So that's a contrast. Okay, so moving on, we're going to talk about each story one by one now. So the Mahogany Fox. One thing they wanted us to pay attention to in the Mahogany Fox is the motivation for why characters are doing what they do, right? So what is the motivation of the fox in this story? So obviously, so the fox plays a lot of tricks on the dogs and the hunters. Remember, he goes up on the log and he doubles back, or he jumps over the creek, or he hops on the back of the car to hide. So he's not trying to fool the fox, or sorry, fool the dogs or the hunters. He's actually just trying to survive, right? His main motivation here is survival. He wants to live. Okay, and also, how does the author make us sympathize with the fox? Throughout the story, the author describes the fox very beautifully, right? His fur, how he's marked, and we see that the fox is very smart, right? He's very clever. So we kind of feel we like the fox, right? Okay, they also talk about how three different groups of hunters and dogs team up against the fox, right? No one's been able to catch this fox, so now they are all going to go against the fox together. So it's a whole team, three teams of dogs against one fox. So we feel like that's an unfair fight, right? It makes you feel even worse for the fox. Okay, also in this story, we see some nice examples of figurative language. For example, similes. Remember, similes are comparing two things using like or as. So for example, a trim figure stood like a statue of speed. This is kind of a funny simile because you wouldn't think of statue as fast, but you have here stood like a statue of speed, right? And then a long, easy stride that ate up the ground like fire. So you have the like there again. Now, a metaphor is very similar to a simile, except you will not see like or as. So they're comparing two things, and they won't even always mention the second thing. So in this story, they say a great shield of raw gold, which turned the dark to silver. So this is comparing the moon with a shield, right? It just doesn't specifically mention the moon. Okay, so moving on to the life and death of a Western gladiator. So what they want us to pay attention to in this story is suspense, right? And suspense is the kind of atmosphere that the author creates that makes us, we can tell that something's going to happen, right? It gives us this feeling that something's about to happen. And through this story, the whole time you're wondering, is Crotalus going to die, right? And at first it starts out multiple of his siblings die, and he's small and he can't protect himself very well. So we feel like, oh no, is he going to die too? Right? And then later in the story, the homesteaders come and we wonder, are they going to find him? Right? They're hunting the snakes. They're trying to set traps. They're looking for their hideout. And then at the very end, it kind of ends in a little bit of a cliffhanger. He says he raised his shotgun. So we assume that he shot Crotalus, but we don't know for sure, right? So it leaves us with a little bit of suspense. Okay, also in this story, I want to point out some more similes and metaphors. So it says it looked like an exposed nerve. So this is talking about his tongue sticking out, right? And it's comparing his tongue to a nerve using like. And then also, he looked like a brand new snake. Sorry for my typo. Anyhow, so it's comparing him after he sheds his skin to a new snake. And then a metaphor, he was a fine old machine. So again, they're comparing the snake to an old machine without using like or as. That's how you know it's a metaphor. Okay, next story, we have the king's provider. So I'll point out a few more similes in this. Now this simile is a little bit different. It says a bullet-like dive. You still have the like, but it's kind of combined there with bullet, so it's a little bit tricky to see. And then he says, they tasted like a very sweet banana. Again, you have the like. Small pin feathers were sticking out of the down like feathers in an Indian's quiver. Okay, another simile. They also wanted us to pay attention to onomatopoeia in this story. These are words that are like the sound they make, like wham, splash, boom, bang, right? You'll see several of these in The King's Provider. All right, moving on, snapshot of a dog. I want to remind you that this story, the title has two meanings. So remember, a snapshot, an actual photo. At the beginning, he's looking at the photo of his old dog, right? The dog he had as a child. And then also you can say a snapshot of something is like a short story. If I give you a snapshot of my life, I'm giving you just a little glimpses into my life, right? So he's telling a bunch of small stories about his dog, okay? Another thing they wanted us to pay attention to in the story was the author's tone, okay? This is the feeling you get as you're reading the story, okay? Most of the story is told with a humorous tone. He wants to make us laugh about the silliness of this dog, right? But you'll notice at the end of the story, the very last paragraph, the author's tone changes from humorous to very serious, right? As the dog comes through the gate and the boy knows the dog is going to die, right? So he becomes very serious at the end. The story is also full of hyperbole. So hyperbole can also be called overstatement or exaggeration. So for example, Rex was as powerful as a wrestler. Or he would have brought back a piano if you had thrown one in. So this is obviously not possible, but he's exaggerating, right? And then lastly, at the end, there was in his world no such thing as the impossible. Even death couldn't beat him down. So another exaggeration. Okay, the hatchet. So the hatchet starts out early in the story with a flashback. So flashback is when they take a break from the current time in the story and they tell you something from the past. So Brian's flashback has to do with the secret, right? He talks about the day where he and his friend were riding bikes and he sees his mom with another man that's not his father, and he knows that she's cheating on his father, right? So this is like this terrible memory in his mind. Okay, another thing I really want you to pay attention to in the hatchet is conflict. So conflict is some kind of problem happening, right? And conflict can happen man versus a force outside of himself, man versus man, or man versus himself. So man versus a force outside of himself can be like man versus God or man versus nature. This is the major conflict in the hatchet. It's man versus nature, right? So the whole idea of the story is the plane goes down, Brian's in the wilderness, and he has to fight to survive, right? So he is fighting against the wilderness, trying to find shelter, trying to to make fire, trying to cook, trying to find food, right? And then he also has that episode with the porcupine, right? So Brian versus the porcupine, okay? So also it's man versus man. There's a little bit of man versus man when Brian's struggling with what to do with his mom, right? So she cheated on his dad and now they've divorced and he has this anger inside of himself with his mom's choice, right? And then also there's some man versus himself, okay? The point in the story where Brian feels like he wants to give up. The plane doesn't see him and it leaves and he feels like he has no chance of surviving and he really just wants to die, right? So he has to fight with that despair inside of himself for the will to live. Okay, so moving on, Old Sly. Old Sly also has flashback. And so this is when Albin is remembering back to when he went trapping with his dad, and his dad tells him about Old Sly, right? Warns him. This story also has some onomatopoeia, words like thump, swish, creak, right? So another thing I want you to pay attention to in Old Sly is Albin's character, okay? Albin is brave, so he risks his life to protect his mom and his sister, right? He's responsible. So his dad gives him the job of protecting the farm, taking care of everything. And he takes the job really seriously, right? He's also very smart. So remember the scene where he's locked inside of their cabin with the panther and it's dark. And he knows his gun will only allow him to shoot one time. And if he tries to shoot inside the cabin and he misses, then he has no way of protecting his mom and his sister. So he decides he'll grab his gun, run for the door, go outside where he's got the moonlight, and then take aim and try to shoot. He has one chance, right? And it ends up really well. He's able to shoot the panther and kill it. So he's really smart. Okay, moving on to the next story, we have Koyo the Singer. Okay, that's the last story in this section. And the setting of the story, the setting is just where the story takes place, right? So this is an island on Puget Sound, and it shows you that right under the title, right? So the setting kind of creates the atmosphere for this story. It's isolated. There's not a lot of people, only him and his dad. There's woods, and they're raising foxes, okay? So also the motivation of Koyo, why does Koyo sing? Okay, and this is again instinct, right? He's trying to warn the rest of the foxes and even warn Brian of, or sorry, not Brian. This is a different character. He's trying to warn him of the danger. So Koyo is just singing due to instinct, like the instinct he has inside himself to warn the other foxes and Dan of danger. Okay, this story also contains onomatopoeia. We have squall, bark, splash, things like that, okay? And then a few similes. The whole place was nearly as bright as in daytime. So here you have the place and then as bright as day. Okay, and then the fox, his yellowish green eyes shone like twin balls of fire in the white light. Okay, so you have light there. And then this section wanted us to pay attention to the atmosphere. And this author creates the atmosphere using descriptions of darkness and light, right? So the woods are dark, but then you have the, as he says, the cold light or the cold fire of the moon and the stars, where you have the light shining off the fox's eyes, creating kind of a creepy feeling, right? And it creates this suspense, like something, you know something is going to happen, you're not exactly sure what's going on, but it gives you the feeling of suspense. All right, so that pretty much wraps up our review, and if you pay attention to these things, I think you guys will do great on the test. Okay, thanks.